Hello, Mr. Ben Werkman. How's it going, buddy?
It's going good, Brady. It's always a pleasure. Glad to be here. We're at our 1 week anniversary here of the contract signing with Sequans. So
that's right. It's been 1 week exactly, but a lot longer in work in progress. That's for sure.
It has, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think when you're going through these deals, you never really know what to expect from a timing perspective, and even me, spending so much time covering this area and watching some of the deals, you don't quite have the same level of respect for what goes into this on the back end. And there's a lot of work happening from a lot of parties, and there's a lot of involvement to get these things over the line. So, being able to get through this one and finally be into the settling period here, I think is excellent, because once you're through the transactions, all focus turns towards the future. And now you're just finding what is the best path for us to execute from here and make sure we can accomplish all the goals that we're going to put out. So it's going to be a lot of fun.
It's going to be a lot of fun. I can't think of anybody better than maybe Saylor himself to be operating a Bitcoin treasury strategy. So I know that a lot of your fans are here. In fact, we've got a comment here that the light is too bright. That is a sure sign that we've got some True North fans in here.
Yeah, I've been taking flack. I even posted and my phone wasn't in dark mode, and so I was taking some heat over that. So I've had to make some corrections. If we do the True North streams, I turn off the lights again, and you got to get back to how it all started sometimes.
If you're not in the know, Ben, always the MSTR True North show happens late at night, and Ben's in this exact spot, but there's the sun is gone, and he's in his shadowy MSTR analyst den down there. So we've got him in the light during the day here this time. We're going to talk about Sequans. Shout out to everybody who is in the Sequans Communications LBE group, the community on X. Glad to have you there. I put the link in the YouTube chat here. If you're not a part of the community yet, you can click through and join. The earnings call, second quarter earnings call happened today. Some of you may have listened into it. And George, the CEO, George Karam, talked about the Bitcoin treasury strategy. We wanted to bring Ben on today to address some questions that you guys put into the community chat as well. And just to talk about what are we doing here? Give some more detail now that we're a week into this partnership with Sequans. So Ben, I'll turn it over to you to kind of kick off the call, and I'll follow up with some questions from the community as we have time.
Yeah, and I think it'd kind of be fun to talk about the genesis of this deal in general, because it really is sort of the first of its kind. And I think people have a lot of questions about what this means and what are the different roles going to be. And they're all good questions because we haven't seen this in the market before. So what was really unique with this deal in particular is, one, the speed at which it happened. This all really started materializing around the Bitcoin 2025 conference. So it was a very short period of time from the genesis of this to the end of the transaction to the signing of the deal between Swan and Sequans. And really what they were looking for was a partner with deep expertise in Bitcoin. And this is becoming more and more important, I think, as more companies are starting to adopt these Bitcoin treasury strategies, because I think it gets underappreciated by these companies when they first have the idea what exactly goes into the back end of being able to run one of these treasuries. And you can think of things all the way from, yes, the high level strategy about how do we want to accumulate, how much are we targeting, how are we going to get to that goal, but also even once you have the capital and you kind of move to the next phase of this and you're deploying it, a lot of these companies don't have the relationships with the trading desk, the OTC desk to be able to go and acquire Bitcoin at this level of scale. When you're buying, hundreds of millions of dollars of Bitcoin, it's a very different process than when retail investors go into their brokerage account and they start, buying through any of the number of exchanges that are available to them. So there's an expertise there in terms of how do you get effective fills? How do you get efficiency in the orders that you're placing, and how long of a period should you be purchasing the Bitcoin over, and you're trying to minimize your impact into the market. But then it goes another step further, because the one thing everyone has a learning curve on when they first get into Bitcoin is really around the custody. And so having a partner that works, Swan's core business is really around the accumulation and the custody of Bitcoin. And so it was a very natural connection point because there's so much expertise within the organization on how to set this up effectively. We know all the custodians, you understand what the rates you should be paying for these different custodians. We've been able to watch all these different corporates, in these publicly traded companies, which does change things, right? When you're a public company, it changes the way you need to approach risk mitigation. And because of that, you really have to go through a serious due diligence period to find who are the right custodians to meet your needs. How can you ensure for your shareholders that the assets you're acquiring and the Bitcoin you're acquiring is going to be safe? And so there is a learning curve on that aspect. And then the other side of that is, how do you communicate what you're trying to do? For a lot of companies, when this hasn't been their core for a very long time, there's this shift that happens when you start to message the new strategy coming out of your business. And you saw some of that come out today on the earnings call with George. And I thought he did a great job of really highlighting that this is core strategy of Sequans. And that's very important. I think the market was really looking for some direction from the executives themselves. Obviously they'll hear it from me, and I'm fairly accessible out here on X all the time, and they've heard it from Corey, but you also want to hear it from the company itself, because there's this ongoing discussion about whether this becomes really a part of the core strategy or whether this is a bolt-on. And for Saquons, I think George did a good job of highlighting that, this is core to who Saquons is now. They are going to be a Bitcoin treasury company. They are going to execute this. We are going to use all the tools at our disposal to accumulate and accrete Bitcoin per share and generate Bitcoin yield. And that is going to be our focus. And, at Swan, that's really where we're going to be plugging in. We're going to take all the expertise, one that Swan built up operating the core business, but two that we built up, through folks like myself who've really been covering the treasury landscape for a while now. And there's a benefit to having done that, which is you've got to watch the journey of other companies. You see how they deploy the playbook. You've seen what tools work, what are the positives and negatives with each tool, because there are, right? I mean, there was a big learning curve when everyone started digging into convertible bonds, and nobody first could have spelled convertible bonds when this all started. And then we all get a master's level education on it over time. But you realize there's nuance with the type of buyers that are involved in that. You're seeing the same thing right now with pipe transactions. And so there's a learning curve here, and being able to be out in the market and help educate investors on what these deals mean, how they're structured, how they execute, and then showing how do you optimize for efficiency moving forward to make sure you're maximizing how much you're increasing that Bitcoin per share is critically important. And so Saquons recognized that, and they were looking for a partner, and they approached Swan, and there was just a natural connection there, right? When you've got a management team that does have conviction around this, they've been doing the background work, really getting up to speed on what's been happening in this market. They've all understood Bitcoin for a while now. When you get that type of connection and they've got the conviction, and what they're looking for is the connecting pieces and the know-how, and how do you communicate this out, and how do you make sure you get transparency out there to your investors through the right analytics and building out the right dashboards, all of which are in process behind the scenes right now. those are just huge assets to any company that's trying to do this. And, we get to kind of be the pilot here for the first deal of its kind here with Swan and Sequans. So it's a great partnership. I thought it was very forward looking on behalf of Sequans to make this deal happen and bring us in as partners to help them as they go down this journey. And now we turn our focus entirely to how do we generate the most value for our shareholders here.
Let's maybe get into the details of the initial deal itself, the raise of the 384 million, how it divided up into equity and debt, and how it's been, I guess, spent so far.
Yeah. So Saquon, so far, they bought 3,072 Bitcoin, and that uses the net proceeds from that capital raise. And so the difference between gross proceeds, which is the $384 million number that you often see, and net proceeds really comes down to there's expenses when you go through these transactions. That's placement agent or banker expenses. They're out, selling the deal and bringing in the investors, and they get commissions on that. There's fees associated with all the filings and things that have to happen. So just kind of the difference between the gross raise and what actually comes into the company. That's the difference between gross and net. So the net proceeds from that initial raise were deployed to buy the 3,072 Bitcoin. And those proceeds were raised through two transactions. One was a $189 million convertible bond, and the second was through the pipe that made up the remainder of that. And this really, it serves two functions. One, when you do it through a convertible bond, there's no immediate shares that go into the market. So, while some people looked at the transaction and saw that, it was nearly a 50-50 transaction in terms of debt to equity here that was being raised, a part of that is you're trying to minimize the number of shares that come to market all at once. So the convertible bond has a conversion trigger at $2.10. And that's when those shares would become available. It's up to the holders when they ultimately convert those bonds into equity, but the conversion price is at $2.10. And then the pipe, people are going through the process of digesting and understanding these pipes right now, but effectively what that is it's a straight purchase of equity. It's purchasing shares of the company. So the date that the transaction closed on July 7, Saquons was trading at around $1.43. And the pipe was priced at $1.40. So it was very close to market price. So these investors that came in through the pipe were essentially acquiring shares at the market price at that time. And so the benefit to doing that kind of 50-50 style split between debt and equity is that when the pipe shares unlock, and I'll talk about what that means here in just a minute, when those pipe shares unlock, there's less of them that have to come into the market than if you raise the entire transaction through an equity sale. So, the pipe unlocking process, you go through, you see the close of the transaction. And then typically after the close of a transaction, it takes a couple of weeks before the shares that are associated with this, because it was a private placement, get registered with the SEC. So the company has to submit a registration statement to the SEC to register those shares to be delivered to those shareholders. So that happened, I think the filings went in on like the 16th. Of July. And then it takes a couple of days from there for the SEC to go through their review period and declare those shares effective. And then when those shares are effective, those shares get delivered to the shareholders, those investors in the pipe transaction, and they're now free to do with those shares whatever they want. It's like any normal investor that's holding shares, right? They gave Saquons capital, and Saquons delivers shares to those investors. So what you don't know when you come to the other side of a pipe transaction is which investors are going to be along for the long haul and which ones might be selling if there's a gain from that $1.40 pipe price that they got in at. So, I think that's a lot of what you've been seeing here in the equity in the early days is you've got a lot of shares relative to what the float was that entered the market. And there's going to need to be some turnover in that shareholder base if you've got investors that are looking to either regain their capital, maybe they've got another transaction to deploy it in, or whatever the reasons are. It's really personal to each of the individual investors. But there's going to be some changing hands of shares that's going to occur through that process. And it'll happen. We've had pretty high trading volume, actually. I think the first day when those unlocked, there was something like 35 million shares that traded hands. And the next day there was another 15 million shares. So you can see how quickly those shares are changing hands, and you're effectively turning over a portion of your shareholder base. And the people that are accumulating the shares at this stage are the ones that are directionally long the Bitcoin treasury thesis. And so you're bringing on a lot of those investors that are seeing the opportunity in an equity that's trading, at or below NAV, where, there's effectively that, call option on execution into the future, right? Because you're effectively buying the equity at the value of its Bitcoin or even below the value of its Bitcoin. And so there's been a lot of, excitement that's been popping up around the equity as these shares are trading hands, and you're starting to see a more energized investor base starting to show up. And, this is one of those periods in time where it's just going to, take a couple weeks here for things to settle. The investors that are trying to sell from the PIPE transaction, they'll sell, or warrants get executed, and that results in shares, and maybe they're taking profits on that. You don't know. You don't know who's selling. It's not like you've got a Rolodex of people that are, are out there selling in the market. You never know. But when you see high volumes, it makes you really optimistic that these are trading hands into, people with iron conviction in this type of a strategy that know what the power is in this when you see the execution start to happen. And that full deployment of the capital, that was a big step, because when you get through this first transaction, what you're effectively doing is building the foundation for the way you're going to be able to deliver in the future. And there's been a few questions about, the scale of the transaction. Do you need to raise several $100 million? And the answer to that is it depends on how you want to operate in the future. If you really, truly want access to institutional capital and you want to be able to securitize and go into the fixed income market and find ways to deploy creative products that end up being highly accretive to accumulating more Bitcoin per share, you need scale. Scale really does matter here when you get started. So being able to start with, around $350 million of Bitcoin from initial purchases is a huge advantage. And one thing Sequans had as an advantage that a lot of other companies didn't is that there was no merger or anything tied to this transaction. Yep. That's the reason why you're seeing this run through the full life cycle of the PIPE transaction, in pretty short order here. This is the first time the market's really seeing one of these actually run through and settle, and that's because there was no delays. So you're just watching what that process looks like as you move from the beginning to the end of those transactions.
What are some of the other advantages, Ben, of that Sequans has over some of these other companies that are trying to pull off the same strategy? It's a public company already. What advantages does that give to the strategy?
Yeah, they actually had a really unique structure, and a lot of people probably haven't really looked into that too much. But being a French company that's solely listed in the United States, right? So Sequans is listed on the New York Stock Exchange, so it's not an OTC ticker, and they're trading via, what's called ADS shares, American Depository Shares. And that gives them a lot of advantages because they're a European company and they're listed in the United States. You actually have access to both capital markets. So they can go and they can look to raise capital out of the European markets. They can also look to raise capital out of the US markets. That's a pretty significant advantage here. The other thing they have that a lot of companies that are getting off the ground don't have is a derivatives market. They've got an options market out there. And, that's a big advantage when you start looking at raising more and more capital and you start scaling, because a lot of those investors, what they need are different ways to deploy their own hedging strategies. And, a lot of that can be through, maybe they're shorting the stock directly, but a lot of them will actually take some of those positions through the derivatives market. And that derivatives market, as it scales up and it grows and the volume increases and what's traded there, ultimately those shares continue to settle. And that means that liquidity is hitting the common stock, right? You have shares that are trading hands regularly. And when you're deploying a treasury strategy, one of the things you really want is high liquidity in the equity. You want it to be a deep enough pool of capital of people that are participating and trading in and out of the equity, that these bigger institutional players can come and start to invest in the ecosystem and be comfortable that they can trade in and out of positions, without materially moving that market on any given day. So building that liquidity, that's part of building that scale, and those PIPE shares getting released out into the market, that builds a lot of liquidity as those shares are trading hands. You all of a sudden have millions of shares trading hands a day, where it used to be very minimal, and you start to see that. And as things start moving, I think you see that pick up even more. So the setup and the structure here to allow a company like Sequans to start executing very quickly is all in place. And I know everyone, and I'm one of them, right? I'm guilty. People probably picked up this habit from me sometimes too, where you're always looking for the immediate next, what's the next raise? When's the next capital going to be deployed? And, I just like to point out that we just closed out the first major capital raise here, deployed all of that capital. And we got the deal signed here with Swan, and we're in the background working really hard and closely with the Sequans team as we develop that long-term strategy.
Great team, by the way.
A great team, yeah, and they're a
Yeah.
ton of fun to work with. I mean, really,
Yeah.
really good team. I think the market will get to know them. They'll really enjoy hearing from them. They're a really great team. But, we're in the background right now, and we're trying to be very thoughtful about how we put out the long-term strategy. Because it's one thing to just show up in the market and put out a massive number way out into the future and try to get everyone excited around that. But, the approach I always like to champion is find a target that you think is going to be very attainable and build an execution plan for how you're going to get there. Show that there's teeth to this so that when you're talking to the investor community, they'll have a way to measure whether that execution is successful or not. If they know where you're trying to go and you can communicate exactly how you're trying to get there, what tools you're planning to deploy, showing what you're targeting in terms of the yield numbers year over year, showing how much capital that's going to take based on, obviously it depends on what the price of Bitcoin is at the time. But, if you really are thoughtful about the way you develop that strategy and you've developed that roadmap so that you can just align the teams to hyper focusing on execution, that's what really makes these things work. It all becomes about execution in the end. And so the reason why I'm not rushing, to throw things out into the market yet is I want to make sure that we take the time as a team to really get alignment on where we're going, how aggressive we're going to be, how we're going to deploy these tools, and which markets we're going to be going after to get the capital. You need to know that the capital is there for you to raise it. And you need to focus on how can we deliver efficiently so that you're not necessarily just tied to doing one-off transactions. You want to be able to do continual capital raising because it kind of lowers that risk vector of a deal going bad and then all of a sudden capital dries up in the markets. And if you're stuck on one specific type of capital raise, you might be froze out of the market, not able to operate as quickly as you'd like to. And so you're trying to build out a framework and a structure that keeps you nimble and keeps you active.
Yep.
So you can continue making progress along the way to what your long-term goals are. So I think when we get these goals out there, people are I think they're gonna like them. It's gonna be good. You just got to give us a little bit of time here. We're on,
yeah, there you go.
business day 5 of this. We're in the background building pretty advanced data and analytic tools around this. So there's going to be some great dashboards that are going to be coming out. Sequans went and built their own to get information out there to the investors as quick as they can. But we've got some really exciting data that's going to be coming that I think people are really going to enjoy. So, we're working hard and we're working fast in the background on this one. And it's just great to see the traction that happened. It's a little bit, I kind of got kicked on day one when we broke into the top 20, and then the president of the United States decided to come and unseat us immediately. So I'm gonna have to fight to get that back. But I guess if you're going to get booted out of the top 20, that's not a bad way to go.
So there are definitely a lot of questions about, like here's one in the chat right now. Remind me of the target for Sequans again. There were several questions like that, asking for more details about the plans. I hear you saying, and I hope that investors will understand as well. It's only been 5 days, business days, so we have the deal. We're working hard, and more to come. What details can you share with us today, if any, about sort of the long-term or medium-term vision for the strategy?
Yeah, I think George laid out some of the details around the short term, right? And I'm going to stay away from giving out numbers because one, you want the Saquon's team to be able to participate in that as well. And so, as we roll out that long-term plan, we'll be able to do that along with the team there. But what George highlighted as he was going through the earnings call today was he was really showing that just because we're through this initial transaction, it doesn't mean that we're done accumulating now. Right. There's still tools that are out there to be deployed as this moves forward in the near term that keeps us able to buy Bitcoin. So, he highlighted things like they've got a healthy cash position within the company. They've got more than $41 million in cash still sitting on the balance sheet, which could be deployed for several reasons into Bitcoin. You've also got the warrants that are associated with the transaction, right? So the $384 million is really the top line from those two primary raises, right? The convertible bond directly and then the pipe raise directly. But then alongside that, there were also warrants that were issued to both the convertible bond buyers and to the pipe investors. And those warrants also have a $1.40 exercise price on them. And what that means is when those investors exercise those warrants and take delivery of those shares, more capital comes in. So I think the gross proceeds, if you add that up, I think it ends up being around another $57 million or so that could come in. So net proceeds, probably a little north of 50 million. And that's additional new capital that would be coming in that can be used to accumulate Bitcoin. And then, throughout the year, there'll also be additional opportunities to go into the capital markets and raise additional equity capital as we proceed through the end of the year. And you want to maintain momentum when you have it. We're through the first transaction here, which is great. It's a great step. It builds that foundation. It establishes the scale. It helps get the liquidity out there into the equity. And now you're focused on how do we maintain momentum, right? You want to keep buying. And I'm a big believer that the more active you can be in showing those purchases, no matter the size, right? Just showing that you're continuing to execute on this strategy and you're continuing to deliver additional Bitcoin and additional Bitcoin yield to the investors. It shows that you're focused and that you're continuing to capitalize on opportunities in front of you. And then you want to be aggressive, right? You want to accumulate as much Bitcoin as possible. You've heard Saylor talk about this being the digital gold rush before. I think that's true. And I think that that's only going to become more true as time goes on here. You've got more and more companies that are entering this market. We have huge amounts of capital out there that are sitting in escrow just waiting to get into Bitcoin. You see Saylor, he's out there, buying Bitcoin like crazy, buying 21,021 Bitcoin, in a day with those preferred proceeds. And that's just the beginning, right? There's a lot of corporate action that's coming here. You start to see the activity out of the White House. If any of that kicks up, you can get a lot of activity out here in the Bitcoin space. And so you want to be mindful that, when you're on the early side of the emergence of these Bitcoin treasury companies, you want to make your initial standing count. You want to get that scale early. You want to be able to raise meaningful amounts of capital going into the future. And you want to build a resilient model. You want to make sure you never get yourself, pinned despite what the market conditions are, right? Market conditions can turn all the time. You can't plan on being in a 10-year bull market. We haven't seen one of those in a while, right? So, a 10-year bull market obviously would be amazing. I'm not counting on it, right? There's going to be times where things get rough. That's how this asset works. And it's how all, investments work, the equities market as well. And so when you're establishing this, part of that being thoughtful in your planning is figuring out the right mix of products, and you've got the equity products, the debt products, the fixed income products, or the preferreds, like you see MicroStrategy offering. And you want to consider what the right mix is to use as you move forward with deploying the strategy so that you're resilient in all market conditions. And it's something that strategy is really excelled at. And I think because of that, it makes investors very comfortable holding capital inside of that equity. And, we want to build the same thing here, right? You want to build a company that investors will be able to see the execution. They'll be able to see the focus on risk mitigations and making sure that you have a flexible toolbox to deploy no matter what market conditions you find yourself in. So a lot of focus coming from the team on that, making sure we're doing this mindfully and not just saying, us too, right? Like we're going to do this too. You want to do this in a way that really meets the goals of your organization and do it thoughtfully. Now that the playbook has been public for so long, you have the ability to customize and deploy it in the best way for your shareholders.
So I'm going through the questions that were submitted on the thread yesterday in the Sequans LBE group on Twitter/X. Here's one that we may not have talked about, and I'll leave it up to you on how much you can answer here. What is the story behind this partnership? Did they seek you out? Who on their team had the idea to become a Bitcoin treasury company? What gave the Swan team the confidence that this was the right company to partner with? Good questions.
Yeah, great questions. Yeah. And so some of it, I think I already provided a little color on that where, they reached out to Swan seeking a partner here in this space. And really, this was a collaborative effort across that entire company. So it was the executive management team as well as their board of directors. So it's one of those rare instances where you get total alignment across the team, and everyone was playing a part in really making this happen and making sure that this was the right partnership. Right. When you
Yep.
start having those discussions, there's also a culture fit that you have to consider here if you're going to enter into something like this where you're all going to be executing together for a long time. And because of that, you go through the time to really get to know each other, make sure that your vision for how these execute, make sure that the focus on risk mitigation is there, make sure everyone really believes in this strategy long term. Because you don't want to partner with a company that views this as a short term opportunity. And you wouldn't sign an agreement like this if you were doing this as a short term opportunity. And, this is something when you're building a management agreement that's really built around scaling these treasury operations effectively, you're planning that as a core part of your business, right? That is one of those value creation verticals that you have to deliver value for your shareholders, on the other side, using the balance sheet instead of the income statement. And it becomes a very long-term partnership that everyone's going to need to invest in. And you want to make sure that your teams are going to be fully aligned so that you can execute efficiently moving forward. So it was a really great process. And it did not take more than a meeting or two for us to figure out that this was going to make sense. They were aligned on the vision. They'd been doing their homework already. They understood what the opportunity was here and the need to be able to execute on this rather quickly. And because of that, we had all the tools in the background to be able to help make that effective and efficient, to get them into the market quickly, to get them deploying the strategy so that, as this wave of additional capital comes into Bitcoin, you can be on the front end of that and really establish your position out there in these Bitcoin treasury companies and start showing the market, how you're delivering towards your goals. And, that's the phase that we're moving into now. So I think it's going to be a good partnership and it's going to last for a long time.
Yeah, I agree. Fantastic team. They are in it for the long haul. There's no doubt about that in our minds. Otherwise, we wouldn't be part of the deal. This is
Yes.
what we're here for. Is to I mean, Corey's been saying it. This really only helps Bitcoin. And at Swan, we often say we want to do one of our company goals, right, or missions, is to do what's best for Bitcoin and for Bitcoiners. We are a team full of Bitcoiners. You have to be a Bitcoiner effectively to work at Swan. So we want to use this strategy to help bring in billions and billions of dollars from areas of capital, pools of capital that cannot access Bitcoin directly. And that's what strategy has pioneered. And that is good for Bitcoin. This is just a way, you can call it the speculative attack. It's a way to get a bunch of fiat into Bitcoin from places where it can't otherwise get into Bitcoin. And so that's why we believe that this strategy is good for Bitcoin and why we are here.
Yeah, I think it also highlights the ability for smaller companies to also be able to implement Bitcoin as a part of their treasuries. And I think that's a really important move. It's kind of interesting when I look at what happened. We kind of skipped the phase I thought we were going to hit first. I thought that this was Bitcoin corporate adoption was going to go through the path of you would have the cautious companies that would convert, 1% or 2% of their treasury holdings into Bitcoin. And I thought that would actually be the first step that we would take. And what ultimately happened is we kind of jumped past that because Saylor really got out there, saw the vision well before anybody else, started executing like crazy on it and highlighting the type of value, which, we're probably going to see here in their earnings today is going to be the first time that I think the market really gets hit with the impact of the type of value that this strategy created. But now I also think that as this matures and Bitcoin becomes safer, you're going to see that trickle down to a lot of these smaller, private companies that start to hold their assets in Bitcoin, right? They're going to protect themselves from monetary debasement and make sure that they're also building resilient companies for the long term. And I think that you'll see that phase of this, Bitcoin corporate adoption start to show back up. But it was very interesting to me that it kind of bypassed it because people saw the opportunity. You see all the spending that's coming out with all the new spending bills, and people are looking at that and they're kind of, turning their head and going, that seems like it's going to be a lot of money coming into the system if they're going to try to stimulate growth to back up these spending bills to offset them. It creates that urgency where you see a problem and you're going, this might become a runaway train. I want to make sure that I'm proactively defending against this now. And there's only one truly decentralized asset out there that's at enough scale right now to be able to combat that. And, that's Bitcoin. It's been gold for a very long time, but, gold has its weaknesses that in the Bitcoin community, we've discussed ad nauseum. And Bitcoin now being adopted as that digital capital and getting the air cover, from the regulators and the clarity, it makes it that much safer to start adopting. And I think that's really what's going to kick off that next wave, which brings a lot more capital into Bitcoin, because there's a lot of idle capital on balance sheets right now.
There's questions about the pipe shares that registered. I think it was last Friday after markets. Can you just explain, like you were saying earlier, and I am also getting an education in finance from Bitcoin in general. I've learned a ton about finance and money, obviously just being in Bitcoin, a whole nother level here about finance in particular, as we're getting into this area of business. So there's a lot of catch up for Bitcoin investors, maybe to understand exactly how the dynamics work between these different tools to bring the money into the treasury. Can you explain how pipes work, and what happened last Friday and what we can expect, from those pipe shares being registered moving forward?
Yeah, I should probably just start with, a lot of people are hearing the word pipe investment and they might not actually know what that means. It means private investment in a public equity. So you're raising capital through a private placement offering, right, in the private capital markets, and you're issuing equity for that investment. So, when the capital is brought in from the pipe investors, so you go out to these different institutions and they sign up for some allocation to this pipe offering, and they give the capital to the company. That capital comes in, goes on the balance sheet. You can deploy it out to buy Bitcoin in this instance, but it's just a capital injection into the business. So the assets within the business are increasing. And for them providing that capital, they're getting issued equity. They're getting issued shares for the capital that they invested. So I highlighted earlier that, the closing price the day that the transaction closed was $1.43. The pipe investors paid $1.40. So only a 3-cent difference there on that capital that came in. So they were effectively buying their equity at what the equity was trading. But you're raising it in the private markets because you're not doing like an initial public offering here where you're raising capital for the shares. You've already got a company that's trading, so you're issuing new shares, and those new shares have to get registered with the SEC before they become effective for those investors to be trading with. So you go through the process where the company goes and does a filing. It's a share registration filing, basically telling the SEC, hey, we got an investment. These are the shares that are going to be associated with it that are going to be delivered to these investors. And then the SEC goes into the review process, and the SEC declares those shares effective, right? They approve it, they're effective. Those shares can now be delivered to those investors. And once those shares are delivered to their investors, it's no different than you and I owning shares in a brokerage, right? Those are shares that are available, and they can be bought and sold as those investors desire. So in the early days here, what you tend to see is you've got the unlocking of shares. Those shares are being made available to the people that provided the capital. And there's going to be some of those investors that are going to be interested in being along for the long haul here. And there's going to be other investors that, are usually rolling capital from one transaction to another. And so they may be interested in getting their capital back from their investment and going on to a new investment. You never know, right? You don't know who's going to be there. You'd love everyone to be a long-term investor that's going to be along for the ride, that believes in the thesis. But when you're dealing with institutional capital, they often have mandates. And because of those mandates, some of them are going to have a very short-term outlook on how they're viewing these as individual transactions, while others are investing in the thesis in this industry and seeing the value in these Bitcoin treasury companies. And so you'll have a portion of those shares as soon as they hit the market. Those are going to be shares that are going to be trading hands. So a lot of those shares are ultimately going to be sold because they're already holding them. So the only transaction they can take, if they're moving them at all, is to sell them for the first time to somebody else. And so you're effectively turning over that shareholder base, and that can take a few days to a few weeks to settle out as you're finding new investors that are long the thesis, that want to hold the shares for several years or whatever their term is. And these new investors may move on to something else, or they may be along for the ride. So you don't know how many shares are going to trade hands in that transaction. And in the early days, obviously there's selling pressure on the equity, so I would assume that quite a few were trading hands, and we saw 35 million shares, I think, the first day trade hands, and 15 million the next. And I think we've been hovering around, 8 to 10 million since that time. So a lot of these shares have been trading hands, and right now they're trading hands effectively, at or below the pipe price. So it's at or below the net asset value of the Bitcoin that's being held. And, as this all settles, then I expect that sell pressure to come out of the equity, and then we'll see where we go from there. But from our perspective, this becomes a journey about execution from here. And you start showing the market that you're committed to the strategy, that you're focused on creating that shareholder value. And then you see where it goes, right? There's the multiples to net asset value are focused on in a big way for good reason in this space. That's part of what makes you able to operate. But in these early days, when we're in the first couple of days since the shares traded hands, I'm not overly surprised at where it's at the moment, but I don't think that it's going to stay here forever. And a lot of the other companies that are of similar size that are now in kind of that steady state execution phase, you see them trading in the 3 to 4 times NAV. I think we peaked at the very highest Sequans ever got to, I think was 4 times NAV. So it's where a lot of these other ones are already trading right now. So ultimately we'll see. It's our job now to show the conviction to the market and show the execution to the market to make them want to be along for the ride with Sequans versus any of the other Bitcoin treasury companies. And I think with the setup that we have and with the buy-in from the management team and with the plans that we're putting together, I think we're going to have a really good story to tell to make the case for, Sequans to be one of those primary holdings for people that want to be in the Bitcoin treasury space, but that's up to individual investors. So it's our job to show the execution. It's up to them to figure out where to deploy their capital.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Ben, for joining us today. I think we'll leave it right there. Thanks to everyone who has joined to watch and hang out with us, learn more about Sequans Bitcoin treasury strategy that we are helping execute at Swan, headed up by Ben and Corey and Jan. Amazing team. I would not want to go against those guys on the battlefield. So I'm glad that I'm behind them and they're leading the charge for us. So great team, both sides, Sequans and Swan. Laser focus on executing the LBE strategy, and glad for you guys. Grateful, I think, is what I meant to say. Grateful that you guys are here early on in the process. The community on X, I linked it in the YouTube chat. It's also on the Twitter thread. Jump in there so you guys can follow along. Lots of good early activity there already. Ben and myself and Corey will be very active there. So that's probably the best spot for now, just to stay up to date on everything that's happening in the Sequans community. So thanks everyone. And, keep following. We actually subscribe to the channel. If you're not yet, I host a show on Fridays called Swan Signal Live. We talk all about Bitcoin and LBEs and all that kind of stuff. You can keep up to date with us there as well. So subscribe to the channel and join the community on X. And I'm just really looking forward to getting our hands in there and executing flawlessly as humans are capable of executing, Ben. All right. Any closing words, Ben? I think you're good.
I think we're good.
You dropped the mic there with the finish. All right. Any other questions? Direct them to the community. We'll see them there. I see some popping up now. And we'll see you over at the community. And until next time, take care.